Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? My name is Joe Lambert. I'm the Director of Information Management Services at the Central Intelligence Agency. And at CIA, my job is to be responsible for the records of the agency, the national security classification of those records, and the declassification and release of those records. So on behalf of our Director, John Brennan, our Director of Support, who you hear later, and our CIO, who's back in Langley, I want to extend a warm welcome to everybody and thank you for coming today. I also want to thank Smith College for making this wonderful venue available to showcase the declassification and release of the CIA records that we're releasing today. You know, a while back, the President asked everyone in the executive branch to be as transparent as we possibly could. We need to consider, however, that transparency isn't simply declassifying every secret that we have. The CIA, and for that matter, all the executive branch agencies that deal with classified information, must balance the release of that information against the necessity to protect their ability to continue their mission and help protect our country. Declassification is a very difficult and time-consuming task, but one that we willingly undertake because it's important work valued not just by historians, but by the public at large as well. Every director of CIA has understood the importance. Despite the complexities, CIA recognizes the real benefits flow from greater public insight into our work and to our mission. No other intelligence agency in the world rivals the CIA's record on declassification. History is a fluid thing, and what we know about the past is always subject to reassessment when new information comes to light. One of the reasons we at CIA love to do conferences like this is it's an opportunity to re-examine the narratives that accompany pivotal events in our nation's history. However, unlike most of the declassification events that CIA puts on all around the country in major universities and presidential libraries, things such as Air America, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Polish martial law, and just earlier this month we released a collection on the 1992 Bosnian War with President Clinton in attendance at his library in Little Rock. Today, this collection that serves as the impetus for the event today is our very first thematic release ever. It turns the spotlight back on CIA and focuses on how the view of women in the CIA workforce has evolved over time and highlights some programs that were begun in order to assist women, but in fact have grown to be beneficial to the entire CIA workforce. The agency's first glass ceiling type task force was established by our director, Alan Dulles, in 1952. It was in response to a question he received from a new female employee in a class that he was addressing. The task force took about a year to complete their investigation of how women were treated in the agency, and the resulting product was a document that the director dubbed the Petticoat Panel Report. A very lightly redacted version of that Petticoat Report is in the booklet that you received when you came in today. The collection contains documents from across the agency, including a glass ceiling report from the 80s and how the agency endeavored to implement the suggestions that arose from it. Professor Brent Durbin from the Smith College here will follow me in just a minute, and he's going to provide highlights on what you see in the collection of records that we're releasing today. But that booklet that you received, the very back page of that booklet has a website listed in there that you can go to receive all of the documents that were being declassed and released today. So without further ado, I want to say we have a great panel of extraordinary current and former CIA officers here today. And as I was at dinner last night talking about today's event and looking through the booklet, I started to think about my own personal career of 30 years in CIA and my interaction to some of the information in that booklet. And as I was thinking back, a significant number of my managers over the years have been women, not men. So I look very much forward to hearing what our panelists have to say today. They have some fascinating stories to tell. Events like this don't just happen. A number of people at CIA have been working diligently for quite some time. I can't tell you their full names, but I would like to say Lois, Peter, thank you very much. Michelle, thank you for all the work that you put into that. And on behalf of all my colleagues again at CIA, thank you, welcome, and Professor, if you would come up.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to also thank the CIA Office of Historical Records or Historical Collection for the work they put into this. And I'll also point out, although Joe didn't, that Lois and Michelle, whom you mentioned, are both Smith alum. So you have them to thank for this event as well. In 1945, Julia McWilliams found herself flying to China in an unpressurized C-54 that seemed to barely clear the 15,000 feet peaks of the Himalayas. As lightning storms tossed the plane in every direction, she and her colleagues wondered if they were even going to make it to their next posting. McWilliams had joined the US war effort at the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence unit. She had already served at OSS headquarters, where she had worked directly under OSS Director William Donovan, and she'd also been on a team tasked with developing a shark repellent to keep the curious animals away from ordnance targeting German U-boats. McWilliams managed to arrive safely in China, where she would be responsible for handling intelligence traffic that passed back and forth to and from Washington. She seemed to like the work and recalled her time in OSS favorably many years later, and not least because that's where she met her husband, Paul Child, when both were on assignment in Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. So, of course, Julia Child, Smith College class of 1934, went on to fame as a beloved TV chef and author. But in these early years, her future success was far from assured. Yes, she was smart, funny, talented, and well-connected. Even so, she was a woman. Asked later why she had considered a career in intelligence work, she replied, "I wasn't thinking in career terms. For women," she went on to note, "there weren't many careers to have. There wasn't anything really open." Such was the reality for an American woman in the 1940s, even one as indomitable as the future Julia Child. By 1953, after the wartime Rosies had been sent home to make way in the labor force for returned GIs, only 30% of the US workforce were women. Things were a little better at CIA, which had succeeded OSS at the core of American intelligence. There, 39% of employees were female, although the vast majority of these were working in low-ranking clerical jobs. That was 1953. Now, 60 years later, women represent 47% of the American workforce overall and 46% of CIA employees, with many women in the senior leadership ranks of the agency. How did we get from there to here? How do we measure and account for the improved status of working women, both at CIA and throughout America? The Typist, a Trailblazer collection, traces the pulling and stretching that was necessary to keep women's roles at CIA in line with changing societal norms, and also with the demonstrated qualities of the agency women themselves, who were consistently knocking on and occasionally breaking through CIA's glass ceiling. The CIA, so unique and mysterious in some ways, but so common or typical in others, in its reflection of the unequal treatment of women during the middle part of the 20th century, but also in its ongoing efforts to improve the status of women, its women employees. Both of these aspects of the CIA experience are in full display in the collection being released today. In the Typist to Trailblazer documents, we see the long evolution of women's roles at CIA. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll highlight a few parts of the collection that tell especially important and interesting parts of this story. So to start, let's consider this panel on career service for women, which came to be known as the Petticoat Panel. This early effort to understand the plight of women at CIA grew out of a meeting between new Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, and his CIA employees in May 1953. Now, Dulles, who would go on to be the longest-serving DCI in history, was asked point blank, as Joe alluded to, by one of his new female subordinates, if he was, quote, going to do something about the professional discrimination against women within the agency. Dulles replied that he thought that, quote, women have a very high place in this work, and if there's discrimination, we're going to see it stopped. So there was support at the top for improving the status of women, even as early as 1953. Well, not surprisingly, Alan Dulles was not able to stamp out discrimination against women in 1953. But he did order a review of women's employment at CIA. And this study group comprised accomplished women from the agency that became known as the Petticoat Panel. Surely this review, the Petticoat Panel, represents one of the earliest efforts in the federal government to understand gender discrimination in federal employment. What it found was troubling, if not surprising. For example, the petticoat panel documents included in the Typist to Trailblazer collection include a graph showing the average salary grades for both women and men at CIA. The panel found that on average, men who worked at CIA were promoted as they aged and gained experience, while women were not. Men who joined CIA later in their careers came in at higher levels. Women with experience did not. In fact, young women's salaries are shown to increase steadily until the cohort aged about 30 to 34 years, and then they flatten out. At about the general schedule or GS salary grade of GS7, kind of a clerical rank. So even as women gain more experience at the agency, their salary and rank stagnate at a pretty low level. At the time, the GS scale, which is the scale for ranking in federal employment, went from about GS3 to GS18 at the agency. So women are encountering effectively a glass ceiling about GS7. Average salaries for male CIA employees rise consistently in the data provided in the documents, and keep rising with each age cohort, earning more than those below them until age 62, where they flatten out or peak at GS14. In addition to these average rates, the panel found that in 1953, only 5% of CIA women had attained what was considered the officer level of GS12 or above, and that no women served in the top 4 GS ranks, the executive level of the association or of the organization. It's worth noting, important to note, I think, that the CIA was not unusual in limiting women's access to important or coveted jobs. When J. Edgar Hoover, for example, became director at FBI in 1924, there were 3 female special agents, the famed kind of FBI G-men, working in 1924 at the time at the FBI. Well, very quickly, Hoover made sure that they left. He fired 2 of them, the other left 3 months later. And during his entire tenure at FBI until 1972, no more women were appointed to special agent positions. At the US State Department, women made up only 7% of Foreign Service recruits through the 1960s. In part, this was due to a ban on married women serving as diplomats. Of course, no such restrictions were in place for married men. I actually recently spoke with a Smith alumna who served at the CIA in the 1950s and 60s for about 10 years, and she recounted that women in the agency at the time were also expected to quit their jobs when they got married. Of course, these antiquated norms began to change during the civil rights revolution of the 1960s and 70s, and several major laws sought to outlaw workplace discrimination: the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, and others. Now, overturning centuries-old social order doesn't happen overnight. To quote another Smith alumna who was once very briefly funded by the CIA, "The first problem for all of us is not to learn, but to unlearn." And there was a lot of unlearning that needed to be done in American society and in its government organizations. Now, that quote comes from Gloria Steinem, Smith College class of 1956, who actually ran a progressive youth organization supported by agency funds in the early 1960s. Despite these new legal pressures, including the creation of an equal employment office at CIA, as well as active support for combating sex discrimination by CIA leadership, including particularly William Colby and Stansfield Turner in their DCI positions, the Typist to Trailblazer documents show that into the late 1970s, very little progress had been made. Consider one document that serves to highlight the ongoing challenges faced by women and leaders at the agency. This document comes out of a meeting in May 1977 between CIA Deputy Director E. Henry Naki and the Federal Women's Program Board, which had been set up to advise agency leaders on, quote, issues concerning women in the CIA and to enhance the employment of women in the CIA. So Naki asked the board for themes that he could take to his agency managers to talk with them about the status of women at the agency. These themes arrived in a memorandum 3 weeks later and provided an interesting window into kind of attitudes at the time. To start, the board recognized that many managers might be wedded to, quote, cultural standards of the past. So this is 1977, remember. These men might need it explained to them that, quote, many young women today are not making motherhood a full-time career, nor are they, quote, simply looking for a way to support themselves until they get married. The board also suggested a personal appeal to supervisors who had daughters of their own. What kind of careers do you want them to have, it proposed asking. Do you want to see their opportunities limited to the GS7 or GS8 level, where the majority of women in the agency remain today? Finally, the board recognized that for some men, anything that sounded like women's lib was bound to be treated with suspicion, if not outright derision. And so it counseled to be sure to remind these skeptics that, quote, women's lib is open to debate, but the law of the land is not. So the need to remind senior managers that their female employees were not simply biding their time until they could marry and quit may seem quaint today. But in 1977, it reflected upon a very real set of attitudes that help us understand how, on average, nearly a quarter century after the Petticoat Panel, not much had changed for CIA women. By 1980, women were still only 35% of the CIA workforce, actually 4% less than in 1953. And only 18% of those employees rated at the officer level of GS-12 or above. That's 1980. Continuing efforts by agency women and a sympathetic leadership eventually led to another major study in March 1991, tasked by DCI William Webster at the suggestion of female members of the Senior Intelligence Service, which became a professional level above the GS scale, so kind of the top administrative level of the agency. This effort led to a publication of the Glass Ceiling Study in January 1992. So this new review found that female representation had finally broken through to more than 40% of the CIA workforce, although women still only accounted for 10% of the SIS, the Senior Intelligence Service. The study's summary document, along with many records tracing the reactions of senior leaders to its recommendations and implementation, are made public for the first time in the Typist Trailblazer collection. Now, at the turn of the millennium, 13 years ago, the gender balance at CIA was nearing parity. 44% of employees were women, although female membership in the Senior Intelligence Service had reached only 20%, double the number from 10 years before, but far from equal. By 2012, the agency was 46% of women overall, and 31% women in the SIS. So in 20 years, you have a tripling of the number of women at the senior levels of the agency. From our vantage here, surveying the first 65 years of women at the CIA, this looks like real progress. Over time, we see the percentage of women at the agency finally begin to increase steadily towards 50%. We see the glass ceiling for women move from the lower clerical level of GS-7 in 1953 to the professional level of GS-12 in the late 70s and early 80s, then to the executive level of Senior Intelligence Service in the 1990s, before shattering, it seems, as more and more women achieve the highest ranks of the agency. In fact, at the most senior director levels, it is interesting to note that now women actually hold a majority of what might be considered the top 7 positions at the CIA. The 3 executive positions at the senior level, plus the leadership of the 4 traditional directorates. So these women include Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Avril Haines, Executive Director, Maroy Park, Director of Intelligence, Fran Moore, and Director of Support, Jeanne Tisinger, who's here with us today. So this leads me to note a final set of documents included in the Typist to Trailblazer collection. These relate to the most recent study of women at the agency, initiated in 2012 by then-Director David Petraeus and conducted by the Directors Advisory Group under the leadership of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. The group was co-chaired by Carmen Middleton, another of our panelists today. This study focused on identifying remaining barriers to advancement for women in the top ranks of CIA at the GS-13 level and above. And its final report recommends a number of concrete steps for overcoming these barriers, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss some of these during the panel and Q&A sessions. So in conclusion, the Typist to Trailblazer collection surely demonstrates not just the evolving view of women in America women in the CIA workforce, but really the evolving view of working women in America for the last 65 years. This collection represents a fascinating trove for scholars and others interested across a number of disciplines. There are real gems to be discovered in its roughly 120 documents, and I encourage you to spend some time with the collection and see what you turn up. Go online, poke around, it's kind of fun. Finally, it is collections and events such as this one that remind us of the importance of the declassification process. Scholars like me, whose work is largely conducted in archives, rely on the people of CIA's Historical Collections Office, similar offices in other agencies to really draw back the curtains of history and allow us to read in the sunlight. And the budgetary pressures caused by sequestration, shifting attitudes towards government openness, really make this a tenuous time for the study of recent US foreign policy and history. And so we in the scholarly community look forward to continuing to work with CIA other agencies to keep our government's history open and accessible while secure for future generations. So with that, by way of background, I'm going to bring up our panelists. We're going to get them mic'd up real quick while I'm doing introductions, and then we'll have an open discussion. We have time for Q&A at the very end, so be ready for that. We'll have roving mics. And I'd like to call up our panelists and take their seats. And I'll just do some brief introductions. The bios for the panelists are also on the back, or inside, I guess, the program that you should all have as well. So starting from my far right, we have Jeanne Tisinger, who was recently named Director of Support at the Central Intelligence Agency. Director of Support is head of what used to be the Directorate of Administration, for those of you who are familiar with the agency's inner workings. Prior to this position, at the support division of the agency, she's responsible for leading the organization that provides key support functions, including security, supply chains, facilities, financial and medical services to all CIA missions and employees, both in the field and here at home. Prior to this position, Jeanne served 3 years as CIA's Chief Information Officer. As CIO, she held worldwide responsibility for the kind of enterprise information technology strategy, architecture development, and service delivery. Ms. Tisinger joined CIA in 1983, spent the first 17 years of her career in technical support assignments, including leadership roles in program management, engineering, systems operations, and customer service. She holds a bachelor's degree in business management and has participated in leadership programs at Harvard and Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. She's also the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award. Next to Jeanne, we have Carmen Middleton, who is director of the Center for Mission Diversity and Inclusion. She became director of this office on March 20, 2011. Prior to that, she was deputy director of the Office of Corporate Resources in CIA's Directorate of Intelligence. She's also served as the chief of the Leadership and Diversity Program for the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence, and was the co-chair, as I mentioned, of the Director's Advisory Group on Women in Leadership. Prior to her CIA service, she served as an open source officer in the former Foreign and Broadcast Information Service, and was in a number of assignments overseas and in management positions in Washington in capacity of open source. She's the recipient of the Meritorious Presidential Rank Award, the National Intelligence Superior Service Medal, the CIA's Director Award, and the NRO Medal of Distinguished Performance. Next, we have Martha Neff Kessler, who is a former CIA analyst in the Middle East and South Asia areas. Now she's currently serving as an ombudsman at the Department of Homeland Security. She was an intelligence officer with the CIA from 1970 to 2000, as I mentioned, working in the Middle East, also South Asia, and on terrorism issues. She held positions throughout the Directorate of Intelligence and served 3 times on the National Intelligence Council as the director of CIA's point person in the Middle East. For 6 years, she headed the Arab-Israeli division and was liaison with US peace negotiators throughout the Madrid peace process. She's been a fellow at the National Defense University's War College, where she published manuscript Syria, A Fragile Mosaic of Power. She's been a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. During her career, she was awarded the CIA's Medal of Distinguished Service and the National Intelligence Community's Medal of Achievement. She's also received numerous outstanding performance awards during the crises in Lebanon, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and was honored for her authorship of national intelligence estimates on the rise of religious extremism, all very topical these days. Finally, we have, to my immediate right, Abby Whitlow, who is executive assistant for the Office of the Chief Information Officer at CIA. Abby began her career as an information management professional at CIA in 2008. She has held positions in classification management and records management. She completed a rotation at the Department of Defense and currently serves in the Office of the CIO. She holds a master's degree in library science from the University of Maryland and a BA in women's studies from Smith College. So with that, I will be kind of kicking things off with our questions. So I want to start by kind of talking about how far we've come at CIA. CIA has come a long way in its effort to achieve a kind of balanced workforce in its representation of women and men. What do you see across the panel as the most important drivers of this progress? Is it pressure from employees, senior leadership, mentors? Put another way, what are the kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for enacting change in a workforce like at the CIA in its equity in terms of how it treats women? And I know, Jeanne, you have some thoughts on this, so I'd like to start with you now.
Okay. So for me, what was key is a small act of kindness that a senior manager paid me many years ago. So I thought I would tee up this short story for just a minute. I started with the agency over 30 years ago. I began as a student intern in CIA. My first professional job interview, and that was CIA, became really my first professional job, and it really became my lifelong career. That was not necessarily the plan, but that was my good fortune. Across my career, I have spent most of my time in technology, but that's not how I started. And I want to tell you just a little bit about that story. Has a couple of chapters. First chapter is about humble beginnings. The second chapter is about having a few tough times as a woman in CIA trying to balance work and family when I was young. And then as I shared how a small act of kindness from a senior officer when I was very, very junior made a big difference in my life and made a big difference in my family's life. So I know Brent already knows this. What I wanted to do is read you all a letter. And this is a letter that I wrote to that senior manager this past spring. This is before I knew I was going to be coming here to talk, and as I thought about what I wanted to convey, I think conveying a little bit about my story was perhaps the best way to get across maybe how much progress has been made in CIA in the 3 decades that I've been there. So if you'll bear with me, here is my letter to Frank. Dear Frank, this is a long overdue note of thanks for all you did for me in the beginning of my career. I'm not sure if you remember me. I was a very junior officer when I came on rotation from the Directorate of Administration in the mid-1980s to the office you led in the Directorate of Intelligence, an office called OIR, Office of Information Resources. I had been a student intern, earning my own way through school, and then was sponsored into the career trainee program, professional development program. Immediately after that career trainee program, I had my first child, and that detail becomes important. After a few months of maternity leave, the DA assigned me on rotation to the Office of Information Resources. I worked for a wonderful human resources officer. Her name is Martha Georgiadis. Those first several months as a young mom and a working woman were very difficult. My son Jake was often very sick with severe ear infections, and I was struggling with balancing my full-time work schedule and his doctor's appointments. Martha was extraordinarily understanding and offered me an opportunity to work a flexible schedule, something that's very commonplace today, but it wasn't back then. I readily accepted the offer. It worked for a while, but Martha could tell I needed more help than just flexibility. She approached me with another offer, part-time employment, for as long as I needed to care for my son. She had pre-coordinated this with you, and she said that the DA, my home organization, would not need to backfill me. This is a good deal for me. This was a good deal for my home career service, or so I thought. My home career service disapproved my request. The reason? Professionals don't go part-time. At this point, frankly, I was not sure that I could continue working for CIA. After relaying that conversation to Martha, she once again approached you about my situation. You came to my aid. You offered me a chance to switch into your career service. On top of that, you gave me an opportunity to serve in 3 different interim assignments across the various business lines of your office. You told me at the end of the year I could choose the line of work that I would like to pursue. One of the assignments was in a records indexing unit, and 2 of the assignments were in technology organizations. To make a long story short, I chose the technology track. In OIR, I had the opportunity at a very junior level to gain experience across customer support, software development, and mid-sized program management. Working in the DI gave me a great appreciation for how important communication is, both written and verbal. Leading IT programs at the directorate level gave me a chance to be part of teams that brought in first article technology. Things like, and this is where I'm going to show my age, the first PCs. Things like client-server technology, the internet, web-based software. These combined experiences prepared me for my subsequent role leading agency IT. So when I wrote this letter, I was the CIO. And as I shared with Frank, so that's my current job. CIA's Chief Information Officer, a business major who worked her way through school, who started as an HR officer, who said yes to an opportunity presented by the director, who said yes to hard jobs when asked to do them, who's never forgotten the act of kindness and compassion that a senior manager showed her when she was struggling balancing work and family. I try to pay it forward now. When I tell the story of my career to younger officers, I always relay the part you played. Someone took a chance on me. Someone saw something in me that I didn't yet see in myself. Someone taught me that none of us are the property of a single career service. We're intelligence officers first. Don't judge someone's potential too early. Give them opportunities and see how they develop. That someone was you. I'm an adjunct instructor in a number of CIA management classes now. I sponsor a talent management program for all CIA information technology careerists. We focus on continuous learning, developing breadth, and strengthening leadership and managerial skills, particularly in our first-line managers. I have 3 kids. They're all thriving. My oldest, that sickly baby, is now 6 foot, towers over me. He graduated from college a few years back, is earning a good living in New York. He's helping run a private investment fund. My daughter graduated from college 2 years ago and is starting her career in client relations and sales. My youngest is a rising senior at James Madison University. He's starting the interview process for his professional career. My ability to stay in the workforce and also be a mom afforded my kids opportunities that so many families just don't have. My kids are all well educated, they're debt-free, and they're independent-minded young people. I'm very proud of them. I share the next part only to add a bit of emphasis to how important your gift of an opportunity was. I was recently named one of Washingtonian Magazine's top 100 tech titans. I, of course, realize that this recognition was really more about the role that I'm in as CIA CIO rather than the current incumbent. Nevertheless, it was nice to be included. My path could have been very, very different if not for you. I wanted you to know the impact you made in my life, in my career, and for my family. This was a very long overdue letter. I hope you're enjoying your retirement. Please know that you made a deep and lasting impact on our organization and our people, and you continue to serve as a role model for all senior managers. Sincerely, Jeanne Tisinger. So I will just sum up here. It was a long letter to perhaps a short question, but at the end of the day, I think it's people that make a difference. And so there are good people who do good things all over the organization. It's about getting critical mass of good people that set the right tone in a workplace, that provide opportunities for people, and extend a hand and pull people up with them. So that's my story.
So trying to, building on that story, we'll maybe get a chance to talk about kind of work-life balance a bit later. Thinking back a bit, in addition to kind of mentorship and individuals who make a difference, what are some of the other factors that we've seen in your various careers that have really influenced how you see women being treated in the workplace, or just how you see workplaces improving in general over the years?
So one of the things I would point out about the most recent report about women in leadership at CIA, the Directors Advisory Group report, is that the construct for that report is really system and self. And Brent, you asked what are the criteria that need to be in place in order to ensure change. And I would say there are two parts of that. That is system and self. I think about that gutsy woman in 1953 walking up to the then director and saying, what are you going to do about this issue? And the director responding so positively to that, well, I'm going to commission a working group and we're going to dig into this because we just can't have this in our organization. And in the documents that have been released today, you can see this ongoing commitment by senior leaders, primarily men, in response to the concerns that women and others around them are expressing around the workplace, the environment of the workplace. So I think that is that system piece. But then, as Jeanne mentioned, it really is the self. What are women doing to raise their hand and say, this isn't working and we need some sort of adjustment in order to maximize the talent that half of your workforce brings to the organization every day. So I think you have to have a desire for change at every level, because if you just had one level desirous of change, you're really not going to make any progress.
Martha, you had your hand.
Yeah, as I thought through this question for this particular appearance, I came up with the three drivers that I think made the biggest impact on me during my career. The first, I think, that is most important in terms of how women thrived during the 4 decades I worked at the agency was leadership at the top. And I would say there are 3 parts to that. There's the attitude of the senior leaders. And they can say a lot of things in terms of policy, but those are closest to them pick up their real attitudes. And I think we've had ups and downs in our leadership. I think mainly they have been individual DCIs who've been quite committed to creating a more equitable workforce, but not always. And I think that that attitudinal piece is important because it imbues, just like any other organization, the attitude of the people around them who make day-to-day decisions. Also, the policies. And I was telling my colleagues that, policies help a lot, but they also set they allow a manipulation, and I think in the case of women there was certainly a time when men made calculations about how many women they had to hire in their unit to at least meet some level of acceptability. Punch that button and that was it. So I think that has gotten better over time, but it's been evolutionary. I think women themselves have made a big difference, and I would divide that into three areas. One is their performance. I mean, I am a real believer in the meritocracy, and it's important. I've seen people elevated into positions that they weren't prepared for. So that doesn't help anyone, and it's particularly deleterious for the person who's elevated above their capabilities. So I think performance is important. Professionalism, conducting yourself in a professional way, and I think women have had to be almost above reproach in this, and I would say in the agency they've by and large done a very good job of setting high standards of professionalism. But the most problematic in terms of women themselves, I think, is their ability to grasp the politics of advancement, which is not easy. And it is a man's world, so what you're doing is grasping their politics and figuring out how you're going to deal with that. So I think those were sort of the key drivers. And then finally, I think social evolution has made a big difference. The roles of men and women in society generally have changed. When I left the agency for the first time in 2000, I was managing a lot of men who were just as often as the women, taking the children to the wellness visit, going to the teachers' conferences, taking over the household in an emergency. And that simply did not happen when I was a young analyst back in the 70s and 80s. So I'd say those are the sort of the three categories of drivers that I think have been important over time.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So let's move on. We've talked about, both in the talk and in the panel a bit, about the kind of evolution over time of the role of women at the agency. I'd like to think now about the agency as one of many organizations in the government, or maybe organizations that you've worked with or in, and how its kind of trajectory might have put it in one place where others have landed somewhere differently. So whether it's the military or Homeland Security or other government agencies or the private sector, how do we see differences across organizations or even offices in terms of how attentive leaders are, how attentive the culture is to the challenges that women face?
I'll let maybe Martha take that first because of her diversity of assignments.
I'm a real cheerleader for the agency's training program, and I think that that has benefited the entire workforce, but women, I think, needed the benefit and got it. There's a fairly intensive early training of individuals, not just in the substantive skills that they need to have, but also building an esprit de corps and a commitment to the institution, a commitment to the mission. And a good deal of training is based upon people coming together from different parts of the agency. So you emerge from it with a fairly clear idea of what you're working for, rather than sort of that narrow little piece that you have. I have not seen that kind of training replicated in the other places that I've worked. There's also a pretty intensive mid-career effort where people are able to sort of decide whether they want to go into a management track, whether they want to stay in a more substantive track. And it's reasonably easy to move from one directorate to another, career service to another. There is that emphasis on flexibility. And then finally, this is a point that I was making again to my colleagues, which they're too young to know about this, but it's important to know that the institution that you work for cares about how you leave and what happens to you after you leave. And the agency has had a very, I think, distinctive program that sort of helps you through the retirement process, helps you make some of those important decisions about finances, second career, and whatever. That, you know, I went through that program. I enjoyed it. I honestly didn't need it in terms of the practical things I was being exposed to, but I found it very heartening. And I think to be that attentive to your workforce throughout various stages of their career is really quite unusual. I haven't seen it anywhere else in the intelligence community or in government.
I guess one thing I would just add emphasis to from what Martha said is the learning piece of it and the really spending time, effort, and frankly, dollars in training our people. Not just to start their career or build their skill, but through the lifespan of their career at the agency. There's a heavy, heavy emphasis on continuous learning. We have a rich set of formal training programs, and those are the things that you learn in a classroom, whether that be a classroom that we host in CIA, or whether that be partnerships that we have with academic institutions. This is strongly encouraged. But also that the time that people spend in mentoring and coaching their colleagues that perhaps are less experienced or more junior in rank, and sharing some lessons learned and pulling people forward. I think that that is something that is encouraged, it's valued, and is a strength of the agency.
So one of the things that both of these comments have made me think about is to what extent do some of the numbers that we find in the documents, for example, about women's representation at the agency, maybe miss some of the cultural aspects about working there that might be different from working elsewhere. And I wonder if the panelists would be interested in talking about kind of how much culture matters in terms of not just making employees feel more valued or more happier, but feeling like you can have your voice heard, right? We talk about how the Directors Advisory Group study in 2012, you look through the documents and there have been several of these, the glass ceiling study in 91 and 92, all the way back to the Petticoat panel, and representing kind of an attention to issues that was present at CIA, even if the numbers weren't changing that much in the early years, that may not even have been present elsewhere, and how much that might change the way that women working at the agency felt about their jobs and felt about how they were thought of by their leaders.
I guess I would, having had a 40-year span at the agency, I think that the feeling of having your voice heard as a woman and speaking out on equity issues involving women, I use that word because I never felt any kind of discrimination. There was one episode which was actually quite trivial, but it really annoyed me. When I was working on the Lebanon Civil War, and I think I knew every hill and every battle that went on there, and a senator asked for a briefing on the war, and I was told that he was a very brusque and confrontational individual, and they thought they probably ought to send a man down there to brief him. And honestly, that was the only episode where I felt like, I wasn't being treated properly. But whereas there was not any kind of, over time, I never felt like women, as a woman, I was not being listened to. I think that it got better and better in terms of the system changing to accommodate women. There was always great concern, starting with Richard Helms, who was the first director that I worked for, and William Colby. Both were very oriented toward helping women to come into the agency in larger numbers. It tended to focus on hiring rather than promotion. And over time, I think there was a richer, more nuanced approach, more studies done, and in our conversations, we've mentioned that there were a number of studies done on women, and the women of the Senior Intelligence Service, the SIS service, decided at one point that we really wanted to look at men and how men in the agency felt about women. And we discovered that there was a good deal of anger and unhappiness with what was seen as favoritism toward women, which I thought was just fascinating. I'm not sure what happened to it, because then I was assigned to another area and I wasn't able to do much follow-up. But I think there's been, over time, a much more sensitive, thoughtful, more sophisticated approach.
Fred, I think there's, if you look from 53 all the way to to 2013 in the DAG report, the workforce is attracted to the mission of CIA. It's very exciting. There's a sense of public service. It gets into your bones. But in addition to that, I would say that each and every officer is really committed to the community of CIA, and they're committed to bettering their environment and contributing to a healthy work environment. And I think Abby actually has a story to tell about her experience in one of the focus groups that kind of will give you a sense of the commitment and the energy, not only around a given account or your 9-to-5 job every day, but really about the community that we create.
Certainly. So I was, as Carmen just mentioned, in one of the focus groups for the DAG, where they're looking to continue to focus on and improve, certainly, getting women into the upper echelons, into the SIS ranks, and sort of how can they improve that process, how can they improve communication and just help people understand the process and what's involved. And so it was a group of women across the agency who were all at my grade level, didn't know anyone. We sort of all came together and sort of had an opportunity to talk about some of the challenges that women face, and certainly beyond that, what are some of the solutions that we can come up with. So it was just a really energizing and really thoughtful experience to, one, be exposed to that. So I certainly have gone in my career in a certain direction and have spent time in a certain area, certainly in CIO, but to be with women from the NCS or the DI or wherever and to hear their perspectives was really interesting. So it was great to see some of the commonalities for some of the themes that women were experiencing that are continuing challenges. I mean, I certainly would say from looking at the collection and certainly where we are now in the studies, we still have ways to go, but it was also inspiring in terms of the intelligence that women had, in terms of the ideas and things that we could potentially do to improve the situation and how to, again, improve access. So whether it's getting more information, whether it's helping people connect with other people, whether it is training and going on with the other development activities that are there, what else can be done to kind of help women appropriately track themselves to be positioned to be competitive, because that's really what we're talking about. I think it's like, how do you even get in a situation where you could be considered? So obviously it's still going to be a competitive process, but how do you get to the point where you're competitive?
Maybe following on that, and also on Martha's comment earlier about kind of understanding the politics of the office somewhat. One of the great things about the documents on the glass ceiling study from 91, 92 is that in that study they did really in-depth interviews, they did focus groups of men and women at the agency to see how they differed in their attitudes. And one of the things they found is that women found that they weren't getting the kind of feedback that they needed to improve their careers from their supervisors, from their peers, whereas men didn't identify that as much as a problem. And I wonder to what extent that reflects either a type of social training that they're coming in with, where they're either not picking up cues or not being given cues by men who are not kind of treating them the same way? Or is it about not socializing in the same way with their male colleagues? And so I wonder if this may be getting to the kind of advice category, but things that you see women coming into the agency or into new careers having or lacking that is different from what you see men coming into, in terms of whether it's a skill set, degree of confidence, capabilities, things like that.
I guess what I would offer, and maybe I'll focus on the advice that I would give, and that is seek people who give you straight talk and speak truth. It does no one any good if all you're able to give, either if you're a manager or all you're able to receive if you're an employee, is platitudes and nice statements about what is going well or what you're good at. Really try to pull out of someone, really, I mean it, what do I need to work on? How would you judge me? What areas, and it's fine to start with the strength, but what areas do you see? It doesn't have to be viewed as a what's wrong with me, what's a weakness, but everyone has development gaps. I often find that particularly managers, when they're first starting out, they're not particularly skilled at giving that plain feedback because they don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And I think it requires a great deal of courage to deal with the emotion that sometimes comes out when you do give someone that feedback. So I guess the advice that I would give is treasure the people that can give you that feedback. Plain spoken language with examples. But don't always expect it from the person that you work for. It's often the people that you work with. Surround yourself with peers that will give you that feedback, and you're going to grow from it.
Brent, I think there's a lot of academic literature out there that says that women and minorities don't get as much or as honest feedback. And so I don't know that I would agree that it's the difference between men and women, majority or minority, but really the comfort level of the manager in terms of giving that feedback. There certainly is a fear factor, but also of any employee seeking that honest feedback. I'll share with you kind of a defining moment around feedback for me. I was in a performance review, and my manager was going through, and we were walking through what I had accomplished for the year, and I'm just beaming, very happy, very pleased. And you know, I'm like, is that it? And she said, well, here's your chance to ask me, what more can I do for you, you know, in terms of the performance. I had never thought to ask my manager, what more can I do? Is there something I can work on? You know, I was there in that kind of passive, give it to me role, and I'll get out as quickly as possible. And for me, it really changed that conversation in future years with my managers, because I started asking that question at the beginning of the performance review. And I think we see generationally younger people coming into the workforce, men and women, want a lot of feedback, and they want it immediately. They're not going to wait an entire year to hear how they're doing, right? So it's really an exciting and challenging time around that honest feedback piece.
I certainly agree with that advice. I think the feedback is extremely important, and you don't always get it from the people you anticipate getting it from. When I said that it's important to grasp the politics of advancement, I'm thinking about the difference in, we all know that there are differences in the culture of different agencies. Google is a lot different than IBM. The agency, I have found, was very different than Homeland Security. It's important as a woman, I think, specifically to understand what that culture is and what the politics of it, what the politics are, so that you understand early on what it is you have to avoid and what it is you have to develop, and what kind of relationships do you have to develop, what do you have to accept and what you don't have to accept. And that's all within a political context, a professional context that arises out of every institution I've ever been exposed to. And again, there's a lot of literature on this, on how these cultures develop and what works in terms of you propelling yourself forward in that environment. I certainly didn't think I was particularly good at grasping that early on in my career, and I think the other women that were my contemporaries felt the same way. I suspect that women today are a lot more savvy, but it's an important thing to get a grip on and get on it early.
And to your point, Carmen, I think seeking feedback is also, as you said, really important. So it's not just, you know, doing it in the normal evaluation cycle that might come up through, you know, your period of evaluation, but to really just, you know, and also getting back to what you said, Brent, about like where it happens or the kinds of things that might make a difference. It's more that it, you know, behooves the individual to be proactive, I think, about getting that feedback to see, well, you know, what could be done better, or, you know, or ask those kind of questions, or in the moment, or what have you, so that you're not, it doesn't have to be a high pressure situation, but something where you can think about the continuous development. So in addition to the continuous learning that you're doing through formal education, you're doing continuous development for yourself through those informal feedback situations with your peers, with other colleagues who maybe aren't your supervisor but are at a supervisory level that can, quote unquote, give it to you straight. So I think that's also important.
getting back to Martha's comments about kind of the culture and understanding the culture, how much of that culture is set from the top, from the leadership position? And again, in the documents you see time and again leaders, Bill Colby, Stan Turner, David Petraeus, really Alan Dulles, driving the study at least of these issues. And do you see this changing as more women achieve leadership roles in the agency, or do you expect it to change with more women at the top of the agency?
So I'm mixed on that. So certainly the most senior officer sets the standard on what are acceptable norms, tries to communicate and profess what the values are. The ability of that senior manager, and this is the however comment, the ability of that senior manager to come across in a commanding way, in a way that can drive the organization and can permeate all the different levels of an organization, really oftentimes depends on the force of personality. And in some cases, certainly the length of tenure that officer has in the organization, so that they become kind of one with that culture, rather than someone that sits on top of a culture that is already pretty cemented. So yes, the most senior leader is very important. I tend to put more money on that first line and second line manager in really setting the local culture of what the mores are, what the norms are, what is expected, what is, how that work unit works collectively, and how the people in that work unit feel about themselves as professionals doing their job, and feel about themselves as a team of people working a mission. So this has been something I have really tried to focus on in the organizations that I work in. It's first line managers are so key. They can either be a huge force multiplier for an organization and propel it forward, or they can stunt the growth and result in some pretty bad things for employees. I don't know, Carmen.
I think you hit it.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to, well, in some ways to Jeanne's letter and talk about questions of work-life balance. One of the documents in the collection, in it a CIA manager observes that he didn't want to hire young women because he feared that they would get trained up and then they'd leave once they got married or once they had family commitments. This has been a big topic in the news recently with the Anne-Marie Slaughter article in The Atlantic and the book she's writing, and with Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. What special challenges face women, especially women starting families or people starting families, who want to serve in government, and how has the CIA kind of tried to manage that, and how has that changed over time? Because it certainly has changed over time.
I think it's changed dramatically over time, at least in my 3 decades. That I shared the short story of the 80s. It was very personality dependent in the manager that you worked for, and their personal views towards workplace flexibility and what work-life balance meant to them. I certainly saw some managers that had a preconceived notion over if I'll give you another small example. I remember applying for one of my first management jobs, was still in the 80s, and there's a theme here. I was pregnant with my second child. And I remember going to the interview, and the division chief at the time asked me how long I was planning on staying. And I said, oh, you know, I was about 5 months pregnant. With my first one, I worked up till 9 months, so I was planning on staying full term. And then I was going to take off a couple of months. He said, oh, no. I don't mean that. And in an interview, he went into a discussion of how he and his wife found that it was better that she stepped away from work, and she has a career now that is, you know, just 2 days a week, and it's much better for the family if the partner decides to go part-time permanently. And I remember thinking to myself, this really should be his inside voice. He really shouldn't be talking about this right now. I hope. I don't think you would see that kind of thing happening in the agency today. So the formal mores on what's acceptable in evaluating people for jobs, I mean, that just doesn't come up. On the work-life balance, I guess I would say CIA is a wonderful place to work because you feel a sense of purpose. You're doing work that matters, and you can, at least for me, I can tie what I do every day in my professional life to what's most important to me in my personal life, and that's keeping my family safe. I really believe that deeply. But there's a double-edged sword to that because there's an intensity to the mission in CIA, and it can just draw you in. And if you don't keep yourself in check and really think very intentionally about trying to maintain that balance, you'll find that you lose it. And there are periods in your career where something's got to give, either on your personal life and the amount of time that you can spend on your outside commitments and your personal priorities, and then the demands of the professional environment. But what you want to seek is maybe you don't have that balance every single day or every single week, but you need to try to do it over a course of a career. And for me, a good part of that balance is, just steal a page from Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. For me, it was also about who I chose as my partner and the balance that we have as a family, because you need two parents all the time, at least in my family, not just on the weekends. And that is huge. I owe my husband a huge debt of gratitude for allowing me to have the kind of career that I have.
I think Jeanne really touched on something in terms of the compelling mission. I'm talking to the Smithies out there. You guys are, getting your degrees and you're envisioning your rock star careers, right? And so you're going to go into the working world and you're going to knock down some doors and break some ceilings and just achieve many firsts. And I think in the CIA, women are very ambitious. Women come in with a lot of talent and a lot of drive, and they want to go as high as they can and experience as much as they can. What Jeanne also touched on is the importance of the self, the choices women make over the course of a career and really over the course of their lives to maintain some sort of healthy balance. And I'll just share one story with you, and this goes back to the importance of a partner. I was in a job and I was going into work almost every weekend. And at one point, about 3 months into this, and I had a toddler at home, about 3 months into this, my husband, had one of those interventions, blessedly it wasn't filmed, that basically said, hey, listen, it's not just your work, it's the office's work. So let's think about how you think about your job. And it was really one of the most important moments in terms of how we as a family kind of grappled with the importance of the work, but also the importance of our family and what were the trade-offs in all of this. And I think that's in the discussions that we see with Anne-Marie Slaughter and the Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg book, women are having these really tough conversations, oftentimes just with themselves. But I think if you're going to get to the right place, you need to be having those conversations with your partners as well.
Well, I was one of those women who had a hiring officer look at me and say, I think you're the type that's going to get married. So I don't think we will be able to take you into the CT program. And I thought to myself at the time, what an undistinguished thing to say. The type? Most women get married, so what type? What does he think I am? Counterbalanced by being directly hired by the Middle East office, the Office of Current Intelligence, and immediately put into the program. So, I mean, you had, as we've been pointing out, you had some people who were, you had some men who were difficult, and you had others who saw beyond gender, and that was, for me, an interesting start. And the intensity of the work that we do and the mission, I think, was an important point you made, because I worked on the Middle East all my career, and it has been intense from the day I walked in until the day I walked out. And at one point, my eldest daughter, Justine, said to me, "I sure wish you had selected to work on Europe." And it is very difficult, I think, to achieve that balance. You cannot do it on a day-to-day basis. I think, if I'm honest, I would say that I felt guilty for most of my career because I would have liked to have spent more time with my daughters. It's been gratifying to me now that they're grown, and they tell me that it's okay, you don't need to worry about it. Everything came out fine. So it's hard.
So let's turn to the most recent Blue Ribbon panel. We've discussed the Directors Advisory Group study a little bit from 2012. The goal of the group was to understand why women were, quote, not achieving promotions and positions of greater responsibility in proportion to their overall representation in the workforce. So acknowledging that there were more women in the workforce, but also that these women that were there already were not being promoted at the same rates as men. So I actually would ask maybe Carmen to start us off by briefly summarizing kind of what the findings were and what the process is for rolling out any recommendations. And also in particular, maybe ask Abby to recount a little bit more. You discussed this focus group that you were a part of. Kind of what do you think are the hopes of those other kind of at-grade people you worked with for moving forward?
So the Directors Advisory Group on Women in Leadership took about 10 months to undertake a study across the organization. And it was research-based. We've got a lot of data in the report. What's really nice about CIA is that we've got very strong female representation. And so it isn't an issue of trying to get more women in the door, but it really is, when you look at those senior-most ranks, how do you ensure that you have solid representation all the way up to the senior intelligence service? So in the 10 months, and as we came down to our findings, there was no one reason why women weren't achieving those senior ranks in terms of at the representational level, which means there was no real one smoking gun, right? But we did find that if we focus in 3 areas, and those areas are intentional career development. The second one was valuing diverse career paths, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all to get all the way up to the top. And then the third was really improving and expanding workplace flexibility, that we believe that will help the progression of women. In addition, it will help the entire workforce, right? I think Jeanne talked a lot about workplace flexibility and the benefit she had over the years. But as I reflect on the letter she wrote, it's clear that she relied on individuals to try to pull levers to make something work for her. And while things have changed significantly, we do have lots of flexible options in the organization. I think there is room to make flexibility an actual workplace strategy rather than a here's a benefit to you, here's a benefit to you if you ask for it. So I think if we focus in those 3 areas, that we're really going to see improvement over time. When we delivered the report to the then acting director, Michael Morrell, he embraced all 10 recommendations, and when our new director, John Brannon, came into the organization, he recommitted to those 10 recommendations. So where we are now is we have an implementation team, we have a senior officer from the National Clandestine Service, who's actually leading this effort in terms of implementation of the recommendations. So I think I was mentioning earlier to Brent, I was reflecting on some of the earlier studies that had recommendations that came forward to the organization, but there was a sense of maybe too much too soon, let's set it aside. That was a really interesting exercise, but in this case, we actually have senior leadership embrace it and want to implement. So we're very excited to see what happens in the months ahead.
And then I was going to say, I'd like to tag on to two things that you mentioned, Carmen. Certainly the diversity of paths was something that came up a lot in the discussion that I certainly was involved in, that there isn't just a one-size-fits-all, or that you're just going to check boxes in order to get to a certain level in your career. And there certainly were women in the group who were, I would say, actively against that, and that was, sort of anathema to who they were, and that they were more about, what's best in terms of the next challenge. What else can I do that would be interesting? What else is going to be dynamic for me? Not just, oh, well, I better go do this next because that's what's expected or that's what I'm supposed to do. And then the other part of it certainly was flexibility. I think that was a major theme that came up in the discussion in terms of, there were women there from all different backgrounds, whether you were older or younger, or single or married, or whether you were a single parent. There were a fair number of those who are also there. So there are other dynamics and challenges that are particular to those groups as well. So certainly I think what you're talking about and where this can potentially lead is going to be what I think will make a real difference going forward, as in it's not just, as you said, sort of a personal benefit or an individual benefit, but something that benefits the organization as a whole. And when we can get beyond kind of thinking about it as, well, I'm giving up something, or I'm giving away something or whatever, but more, how am I enhancing the mission by making sure my employees are at their best? And by at their best, that may mean different things for different people. Then you're really kind of tapping into something that I think could be really quite powerful. So I'd add that in.
I want to add just one comment, and I think that what Carmen and the folks that she worked with laid out, just what was so crystal clear, is the importance of not seeing what the career path is, but what my career path is. And that's a real difference. It's one thing when you think about achieving transparency on what it takes to get ahead in an organization, and too often what we say is that's the path for everyone. And it's not the path for everyone. That there is, as you say, the lattice of the career as you move across. And there are many men and women that need some time, whether it is at the beginning of their career, at the end of their career, or in the middle of their career, where outside demands require that perhaps the foot isn't as heavy on the gas pedal and they lift it up just a bit. But when they're ready to push it back down again, we need those kind of on-ramps for them. And I know I really got that out of the DAG study. And I think there are managers that understand that at the local level that can help officers. But I think that is something that we need to institutionalize so the system takes care of it more than just the individual.
Let's stick with the kind of future of the agency and what kind of changes you might see coming down the pike. Thinking about more broadly the kind of mission of the agency and the types of work that are going to be important in the future. We're very proud of our engineering program here, for example, at Smith. And STEM training is an area that traditionally hasn't been as available to or as pursued by women. What are the types of skills and characteristics or abilities more generally that you see as becoming more important at the agency as kind of missions change? And is there some relationship between those and the types of skills that often men or women might pursue in their education, but also in their careers?
Okay. So I guess I'll start with what I see as perhaps constants we've always looked for. They're just really key differentiators in people. And that is, you got to have smarts, right? But you got to really have really good critical thinking skills. So important. We want domain expertise in whether that is a regional area focus, whether that is in a STEM path, whether that is in business services like accountants or whether that is in our medical professionals. We want folks to come in with that domain expertise. But we also want folks that have an ability to adapt, deal with high levels of ambiguity, be able to think expansively about what their job is, what the boundaries of that domain that they came in to maybe practice, or that craft that they came in to practice. Because the world in which we live in needs multidisciplinary approaches to multidisciplinary challenges that are global in nature and not confined by the boundary in a geographic region. So there certainly are things that you can train for and learn in an academic setting, but a lot of this is about the way people are coming in and how they think about how they're going to work in an organization. It's hard to assess up front. You kind of know that when they come in and you see it. Perhaps, Martha, you have a sense. One of the things I've always really respected is our analytic cadre in doing what I just described.
Yes, I think that the world, particularly after the information revolution, really become much more complex. The collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of a multipolar world, rise of the developing countries have made the challenges much greater than they were during the early years of the agency, where we were really quite focused on the Soviet Union. And the developments in technology and warfare and whatever have required that we not only have broad expertise in those areas, but that we also develop greater analytic skills. And I've been very involved in teaching mainly at Homeland Security, but also at the FBI Academy, structured analytic techniques that can help us to avoid some of the intelligence failures that we've had in the past. And that's been a really exciting thing for me. I think it's very important and something that is quite unique, I think, to the intelligence community, but has application for critical thinking in universities and everywhere. So yes, I think you're right on in terms of what we will need now and in the future.
So with that, maybe we'll go ahead and move to questions from the audience. I'll take them from the podium so I can see. And I think there may be some roving mics. Yes, I see Michelle with a mic. So just raise your hand if you have a question for our panelists. You can direct it individually or to the whole panel. And I know there are some issues that remain to be covered. So please, sir. And wait for the mic as you prepare for your question. Here it comes.
Thank you. My name is Walter Engels. I'm a 1959 graduate of Niagara University. 20 years before that, while Bill Donovan graduated from Niagara University. I left college a few months later. I was in the Army Intelligence School, and shortly thereafter, I was told I would be picked up by a green van, not a gray van or a black van. And I wound up being involved in the interpretation of the Francis Gary Powers overflight material, all of the film that we got back. At the time, and I'm thinking of the women now, one of our offices in Alexandria, or your offices at Alexandria, had about 40 men and 1 woman. I do recall she was a GS-11 and never made GS-12. But she was not tough as nails, she was tougher than nails. She was an analyst and very good at it. The other office was in K Street Northwest above a garage, and that was basically the CIA office. And as I recall, there were 3 women there and about 50 men. 1 analyst, 1 clerk, and 1 gal who was the top secret control officer. And I can tell you that I don't know how they stayed, because they were the butt of many jokes, and they all stayed and they were there when I left. But I would like to thank you women for all that you have done, because my oldest daughter just finished a career as a public affairs officer with the Marine Corps and suffered some of the same issues I've heard about today all the way through. So thank you very much. And my one question was, how, with the intensity of the work, how are you able to reward women, or how can women who work there get appreciated outside of the agency when so much of what they do cannot be discussed?
Well,
Pause.
I think everybody kind of has to buy in to the fact that they're not going to get a lot of pats on the back publicly. That's part of the buy-in, and makes it all the more important that you are recognized within the agency. That was certainly my understanding and certainly my experience. The rewards I got for what I did, I got from my colleagues.
Yeah, you kind of get coming in, or maybe you learn it quickly after. We're meant to be the silent hand in the silent service. I do think that events like this and others that Joe Lambert and his staff have put on have helped American people understand a bit of our history and see through the lens of history CIA's contribution. And those contributions are of women and of men. I think you're getting at an excellent point, and that is the most fundamental need of human beings is acknowledgement. But that can come in many different ways, and acknowledgement is about having an organization let you give voice to your opinions, your thoughts, your expertise. It is about a sincere and genuine thank you when there is a job well done. And there is a good bit of acceptance inside the organization. It's really not about the public praise outside our organization, and I totally agree with Martha. It makes it all that more important that inside CIA that our managers, our colleagues, our supervisors are very sensitive to that.
Thank you. I'll actually take moderator's prerogative and ask a little bit of a follow-up, which is that, is it true, or is it still true that women need not only be tough as nails, but tougher than nails in some cases, particularly in certain areas of the agency or areas of government?
I think I've only had moments of being tougher than nails.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessary. I really don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you modulate your style, but you have to be true to who you are. Mm-hmm. And sometimes situations require tough calls that aren't popular, and you shoulder some of that. But I don't think that the agency makes you something that you're not already inside.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Alexa Fifield. I'm from Mount Holyoke College, just down the road. I have 2 questions for you. One is directed towards Ms. Whitlow, and I was wondering, have you seen some of the benefits of going to an all-women's college within your career, or what have been some of the benefits that you've had or that you think that have served you well from going to a women's college? And my second question is, what are some of the characteristics that you look for when hiring or that you admire within your peers or leaders within the CIA?
Okay, I'll take the first question since I don't do any hiring, and I'll let you ladies go for the second one. Okay, so I would definitely say from going to women's college, being a Smith graduate, it was definitely beneficial. I think during my time at Smith, I was able to, I'll say, find my voice. It was something where I was able to learn how to do some of that critical thinking, learn how to communicate better, learn how to debate and argue points, and certainly learn how to collaborate and be a team member, all of which I think are very important in the agency environment. So there's no question that going within this environment where I was able to, I think, do that more and kind of, get more comfortable with that, so then when you are thrown back sort of in a mixed environment, then you're much better able, or at least I felt I was, to articulate things and certainly to speak up. And that plays on something we talked about earlier about how things have changed, and maybe in the past women might not have felt as comfortable about speaking up, although certainly the women back in 1953 did. But I would certainly say today, and in the environment and with the folks I came in with, I would say they're very I would say vocal, opinionated, and smart, strong women, and very talented. So, I mean, I was highly impressed with the class I came in with and the other peers that I've met so far through my career. So, absolutely, being a Smith grad was definitely, for me, a plus.
I would say that Abby is really a model of what we're looking for at the agency. So in addition to, the skills, the right background, maybe some global experiences, foreign languages, what we are looking for are leaders, and leaders who want to grow over the course of a career. So kind of that combination of skills and that leadership attribute, I think, is so attractive in terms of what we're looking for CIA candidates.
Yeah, I would only add, or maybe it's just to amplify what others have said and what I shared before. Clearly, we want folks who have built some expertise in that field that they are pursuing. Big for me is I want to see evidence of a work ethic. And clearly your GPA shows or demonstrates a certain aspect of a work ethic and seeking to achieve mastery of a subject matter domain. But I also want to see, what are they doing in the community? What have they done in outside activities? I'm big, I'm going to show my bias here. And this is interesting, some studies for women. Are they involved in sports or in competitive environments where they have shined and led? And I'm not talking about, what is their time in a 400 meters. I'm talking about being able to work within a team environment, being comfortable in your own skin, seeking a goal and going after it. I think that looking at the non-academic piece of their portfolio can be very telling on how a man or a woman, but particularly a woman, is going to assimilate into a competitive work environment and thrive. And then the last one, and you know it when you see it, and you certainly know it that when you don't see it, and that is poise, a calm, competent demeanor, and dealing with issues. And for those of you that are starting to look for jobs, it starts with being ready in the interview process and doing your research and presenting yourself in the best way you can to those that are assessing you for hiring.
Thank you. Yes? Just wait for a second for the mic. Good, thanks.
My name is Victoria. I'm a sophomore at Smith College. This question is directed towards Ms. Kessler. Working in the Middle East, there's obviously a lot of conflict and turmoil, and sometimes, did you ever feel that if you worked really hard and it didn't pay off in some way? How did you deal with that? Because I feel like there's so much issues and you can't fix them all.
I'm quite sure we haven't fixed any. Just say that right up front. I participated in another event like this at the Nixon Center when the CIA released documents having to do with the 1973 October War. And I told that group that that experience was so searing for me. I was very young. I was just out of my probationary period, so I had been in the agency for 3 years. I was in my mid-20s. And it was such a difficult experience that I had a long conversation with my parents about whether I wanted to stay in a profession where the consequences of being wrong were so great. And I obviously made the decision to stay. But I think one of the highest values of an intelligence officer is to give objective, unpoliticized information and analysis to policymakers and to be supportive of policy without trying to influence it. And in that respect, I think we did quite well. The outcomes, not our problem specifically. I mean, they are policy issues. But I think your question is really, how easy is it to have that kind of mayhem, which it really was, often long periods of mayhem like the Lebanon War and the rise of terrorism. And it has been difficult. I think that I said earlier that I think I only had moments of being hard as nails, but at times you really have to steel yourself emotionally from what it is you're reading and what it is you're trying to deal with. I had episodes where I was on task force dealing with wars coming in at 4:30 in the morning, and that's rough. It's not always like that, but there were certainly episodes like that. And I made it through. But I think it always was quite exciting and always challenging, and for the most part, I think quite rewarding.
Hi, my name's Leslie Hill-Sammer and I attend Smith College. The Lean In campaign by Cheryl was mentioned today by 2 of the panelists, and I actually run a chapter here at Smith. And one of the things the campaign focuses on is the fact that women are often told they're bossy, especially when they're trying to become a leader. I'm wondering also, since you mentioned peer reviews and sitting down with your managers, have you ever been told you're bossy, and is that a problem sometimes that you come across? Thank you.
That's a great question. So my inner voice says I'm bossy all the time. Although no one's ever really said that to me. It's interesting the way the terminology that's used for men versus women. So, men might, if they're exhibiting the same behaviors, it may be, God, that guy's got some good leadership potential, but that girl's bossy. We do know that we still have gender bias in the American workplace, and women are trying to ensure that, we don't want to necessarily have to adopt all of the attributes that our male colleagues have in the workplace. We want to be ourselves. We want to be our authentic selves and lead in the way that leverages our strengths and that really can bring people with us. I don't know that I've ever heard that term used for women at CIA or during my career, although from everything that literature says, it's still used, unfortunately.
I mostly was called that by my children. rather than my colleagues. So perhaps my colleagues, that was their inner voice. I think it gets back to figuring out in your own way what your leadership style is. And when you're in positions of authority, how do you exercise that authority in a way that people respect that authority and you're able to give direction and lead without coming across as if the workforce that you're leading has no voice of their own. So I think you just have to personally reflect on what is that leadership style. I personally do believe, much like Carmen said, women are scrutinized more than men sometimes in how they exercise that authority.
So we have time for one more question in the back.
At Smith, and I have more of a general question, which is, how do you take an institution or bureaucracy like the CIA and imbue it with the dynamism and innovation that is true of organizations when they're very young? And what role do you think women have in that job?
You want to start with that one, or?
I'm not sure I understood the question. I couldn't hear.
I think it's how do you keep the kind of dynamism of a young organization going once a bureaucracy gets large and complicated and well established? And do women have a particular role in keeping that kind of dynamism alive?
So maybe I'll take a crack. I don't know that I see a difference between men and women in regard to that challenge. In any large bureaucracy, whether it is, or any large, organization, whether it is public or private, there is a bureaucracy that can result in kind of entrenchment and difficulty to move. And how do you inspire forward momentum on things that excite people? Most of my career, I've had the advantage of a lot of the catalyst was on the outside, and that is in technology, because it's moving like this and it's not waiting for you. Time marches on. So for me, it was in different organizations that I led, is pick 3 or 4 big things that are informed by the opportunity on the outside to leverage technology innovations, and then challenge folks to bring them to the inside. And then what you have is an opportunity as you try to tackle those challenges, or what Joe knows this because he worked in my organization, what I call my big bets, is really recruit converts for those big bets, put your A team on those big bets, and drive for action, drive for accomplishment, and then reinforce the message of we're making progress, and hopefully we've achieved whatever the particular outcome was that you wanted, and then communicate, because that has a reinforcing effect that you can go do some bold, audacious things if you pick a few, not too many, but pick a few and focus your attention on them.
I think one thing that today really shows in terms of the organization, so you look back at 1953, we were a much smaller organization, relatively in our infancy, if you will, and then now we're kind of a middle-aged bureaucracy. That said, you can see kind of this commitment of both leadership and the officer cadre of CIA wanting to drive for positive change. And my hope is that after the study that we just recently concluded, that in another 15, 20 years, Abby here will lead the next one and really put the next milestone in this conversation around women in leadership.
So before I invite Joe Lambert back up, I want to speak to the students for a second. I can affirm Carmen's earlier comment that many of you will have rock star careers. And in whatever field you're in, I'd encourage you to remember when you get there what rock stars do, which is give their time back, their very valuable time and energies back to those coming after them. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for their time and words of wisdom today. And now I'll turn it over to Joe for some closing remarks.
So just very briefly, I want to thank everybody for coming again today. I think this has been an exceptional event. I hope from the speakers' comments we've pulled the curtain back just a little bit to afford you a view inside CIA. I think one of the things that sets the CIA apart is we take pride in that we have leadership at all levels of our organization. And I think you've seen here on the stage today and heard here on the stage today, we have the very senior-most leaders at CIA, and we have people that are leading from the middle. I've had the pleasure to work for Jeanne for a number of years, and one of the things that she's taught me is that strong leaders, whether they're men or women, give credit when things go right and take credit when things go wrong, and I've never forgotten that. I've seen it in action. The CIA is a wonderful place to work. I've been there 3 decades and can count on my 2 hands the number of times I was not excited to get up and come in the morning. So I want to thank our exceptional panelists for their comments today. I want to thank Smith College and Professor Durbin for the venue. We have just a couple of tokens that I'd like to give to everybody while they're still here on stage. So Michelle, if you're behind me. First to Professor Durbin. It's just a small token. It says, presented by the Central Intelligence Agency to Brent Durbin, Smith College Government Department, for your extraordinary contribution to the Typist to Trailblazer Symposium. So, thank you.
Thank you.
They all say essentially the same thing, so let me just start at the other end, and rather than have them come to me, I'll go to them. So, Jeanne, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Carmen, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Martha, thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Abby, as well. For those of you interested in history, our next event is at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library on the 13th of November, and it's going to be on the Camp David Accords, and Jimmy Carter is going to keynote the event. So once again, thank you to Smith College. I hope you enjoyed your time here, and good night.